My child, something changed the moment your soulmate finally asked a question no one expected them to ask. Until then, they had been carrying someone else's warning as though it were their own decision. They had been told not to return, not to reopen the connection, not to look too closely at what still remained between you. The advice sounded confident. It sounded protective. It even sounded reasonable when they first heard it. But there was one detail nobody could explain. If walking away from you was truly the right choice, why did their heart become quieter instead of lighter? That question followed them into ordinary moments. It appeared when their phone was silent. It returned when a familiar memory crossed their mind without warning. It surfaced when someone casually mentioned love, timing, second chances, or the strange way two people can matter to each other even after distance enters the story. And slowly, something inside them stopped accepting the version they had been given. Don't skip, because the shocking truth was not that someone had warned them about you. The deeper truth was why that warning had affected them so strongly in the first place. Your soulmate had already been uncertain, already afraid of repeating old disappointments, already wondering whether returning to something meaningful could leave them vulnerable again. So when another person said, "Maybe you should stay away," those words landed on a fear that already existed. They did not create the distance. They gave the distance a reason to hide behind. And for a while, your soulmate believed that reason. They told themselves they were being sensible. They convinced themselves that silence meant strength. They tried to make the absence feel final by refusing to examine why they kept thinking about you. But emotions have a quiet way of revealing what logic tries to bury. The more they attempted to close the door, the more they noticed everything that had never truly been resolved. Not dramatic memories. Not imaginary perfection. Small things. The way you listened when they were trying to explain something they could barely explain to themselves. The moments when you noticed a change in their mood before they said anything. The strange comfort of not having to perform around you. These were not grand declarations. That was exactly why they became impossible to dismiss. Something important is waiting for you here, because this story turns on something remarkably simple. One evening, your soulmate found themselves remembering a conversation they had almost forgotten. Someone had once asked them what they wanted from a real connection, and without thinking, they had described honesty, peace, emotional safety, laughter without effort, and the ability to be imperfect without feeling disposable. Hours later, the realization came quietly. Almost everything they had described reminded them of moments they had experienced with you. Not every moment had been easy. Not everything between you had been perfect. But suddenly they understood something the warning had encouraged them to overlook. They had been measuring your connection by the moments that frightened them instead of the moments that revealed its real character. And that realization unsettled the entire story they had been telling themselves. Imagine the pause that followed. Imagine discovering that the decision you believed was protecting your peace might actually have been protecting you from vulnerability. Your soulmate did not immediately run back. That would have been too simple, and this was not a simple realization. Instead, they began replaying what had happened with different eyes. They remembered what had been said about you, but now they separated those words from their own experiences. Was the warning based on what the other person truly knew, or on what they assumed? Was your soulmate reacting to something you had actually done, or to what they feared you might eventually do? And then came the question that changed everything: what do I know because I experienced it myself? The room felt different after that question. Because once they removed everybody else's interpretation, the picture became unexpectedly clear. They remembered disagreements, yes, but they also remembered repair. They remembered uncertainty, but they also remembered sincerity. They remembered distance, but they could no longer pretend the connection had meant nothing. Stay till the end. Because the shocking truth was beginning to take shape, and it was not about betrayal, secrets, or anything frightening. It was about misunderstanding. Your soulmate began to recognize that the warning they received had been built around an incomplete picture of you. Someone had seen one chapter and assumed they understood the entire book. They had heard about one difficult moment, one hesitation, one period of silence, and connected the missing pieces themselves. Your soulmate had accepted that interpretation because it matched the uncertainty they were already feeling. But now something no longer fit. They remembered your intentions more clearly than the story they had been told about them. They remembered moments when you could have chosen indifference but didn't. Moments when you gave space instead of forcing an answer. Moments when you remained kind even while confused. And one memory, especially, returned with unusual clarity. There had been a moment when your soulmate expected you to react in a certain way. Maybe defensively. Maybe impatiently. Maybe by turning everything into an argument. But you surprised them. You stepped back. You let the moment breathe. At the time, they misunderstood your quietness. They wondered whether you cared enough. Now, with distance and perspective, they finally saw another possibility. Perhaps your silence had not been a lack of feeling. Perhaps it had been restraint. Perhaps you cared enough not to make an emotional moment harder than it already was. That one reinterpretation opened the door to another, and then another. Suddenly old moments were changing meaning. Things that once looked like hesitation began to look like caution. Things that once felt like emotional distance began to look like two people struggling to communicate while protecting their own hearts. Nothing became magically perfect. But something became fairer. Your soulmate was finally looking at you through their own eyes again. And here is where the story becomes deeply personal. Sometimes the truth that changes everything is not new information. Sometimes it is an old memory finally understood correctly. Your soulmate did not discover some impossible secret about you. They discovered how much of their decision had been shaped by voices outside the connection. And when they recognized that, an uncomfortable but freeing realization followed. If they wanted an honest answer about you, they would eventually have to stop asking everyone except themselves. Don't skip this next part, because this was the moment their emotional direction shifted. They picked up their phone. Not to call you. Not yet. They simply opened the place where your name still existed. For several seconds they did nothing. There was no dramatic message waiting. No perfect sign. Only your name, a quiet screen, and the strange awareness that their feelings had survived much more distance than they expected. They scrolled just far enough to find an old exchange. Something ordinary. A conversation that would look meaningless to anyone else. Yet one sentence stopped them. It reminded them that long before things became complicated, there had been an ease between you. A natural rhythm. A feeling that neither of you had needed to manufacture. And that was when the shocking truth became impossible for them to avoid. They had not stayed away because they had stopped caring. They had stayed away because caring still mattered enough to scare them. That difference changed everything. Their entire understanding of the separation shifted. Suddenly, returning did not mean admitting they had been wrong about everything. It meant admitting they were willing to look again. It meant recognizing that protecting yourself and closing your heart are not always the same thing. It meant allowing the possibility that a connection can deserve another conversation without guaranteeing a particular ending. And strangely, that thought brought them more peace than all the advice telling them to forget you. But something else happened immediately afterward. Your soulmate remembered exactly who had first given the warning. And why that person might have interpreted your connection the way they did. The answer was not cruel. It was not sinister. In fact, once your soulmate saw it clearly, they understood that the person may have believed they were helping. Yet there was one missing detail in that warning, one piece of context that had never been mentioned, and discovering it forced your soulmate to reconsider nearly every assumption they had made about the moment they walked away. They stared at the old conversation again, then returned to a memory they had avoided for a long time. This time, they noticed something different. A sentence. A timing detail. A reaction they had misunderstood. And suddenly the question was no longer, why should I stay away from you? It became, what if I never knew the full story? That question is where everything begins to turn, because the missing detail they are about to uncover does not simply change how they see the past. It changes what they may choose to do next. What they discovered next was so quiet that, at first, your soulmate almost missed its importance. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sudden confession, no moment that looked extraordinary from the outside. It began with a detail buried inside an old memory, the kind of detail that only becomes visible when someone finally stops looking at the past through emotion and starts looking at it through understanding. Your soulmate remembered the exact day the warning had been given. They remembered the tension in the conversation, the uncertainty they had already been carrying, and the way the other person had spoken as though they knew something your soulmate did not. At the time, those words felt convincing because they arrived at the perfect moment to confirm a fear. But now, something about the timing seemed strange. The warning had come immediately after your soulmate had shared only part of what happened between you. Not the full conversation. Not what you had said before the difficult moment. Not what you had done afterward. Only the part that hurt. And suddenly your soulmate realized something incredibly important. The person who advised them to stay away had never actually heard the whole story. They had responded to a fragment. One emotional fragment. And your soulmate had built a major decision around advice formed from incomplete information. Let that settle for a moment, because this is where their understanding started changing rapidly. They remembered explaining how confused they felt, how uncertain your silence made them, how they could not tell whether you were pulling away or simply processing everything. But they had never mentioned the conversation that happened shortly before the distance began. They had never explained the way you had tried to communicate something difficult without creating more tension. They had never described the hesitation in your voice, the care behind your words, or the fact that you had clearly been struggling with your own emotions too. They told the story as someone who was hurting, not as someone trying to present every side fairly. That did not make your soulmate dishonest. It made them human. When people feel uncertain, they often tell the part of the story they understand best, and pain is sometimes easier to describe than complexity. But now your soulmate could see what that incomplete version had created. The person listening had filled in the blanks. They assumed your quietness meant disinterest. They assumed your hesitation meant uncertainty about the relationship itself. They assumed your need for space meant you were preparing to leave. Then they gave advice based on those assumptions. Protect yourself, they had essentially told your soulmate. Do not go back. Your soulmate heard those words at exactly the moment they were searching for certainty, and certainty can feel comforting even when it is built on something incomplete. Don't skip, because what happened next was the first real crack in the wall they had placed between you. Your soulmate went back further into the memory, almost as though they were watching the entire scene from outside themselves. They remembered something you had said before everything became complicated. At the time, the sentence seemed ordinary. Now it carried a completely different meaning. You had said something that suggested you were not trying to disappear at all. You were trying to slow things down enough to understand what both of you actually needed. Your soulmate had heard caution and interpreted it as rejection. Yet looking back now, they finally recognized the difference. You had not been closing the door. You had been trying to stop the connection from being damaged by rushed emotions. And that realization landed deeply because it explained something your soulmate had never been able to understand, why your actions afterward never fully matched the story that you did not care. If you had wanted nothing to do with them, why had you still shown concern in small ways? Why had you remembered details? Why had certain conversations still carried warmth despite the distance? Why had your silence never felt completely cold? For the first time, those contradictions began making sense. Your soulmate had been judging your intentions through the lens of their own fear. The warning simply strengthened that lens. Something important is waiting for you here, because the truth that changed everything was not that another person had intentionally separated you. It was more subtle, more realistic, and in some ways more powerful. Your soulmate had allowed an outside interpretation to become louder than their direct experience with you. And once they recognized that, they could no longer pretend the decision to stay away had been completely their own. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for a long time. What would I have done if nobody had advised me? What would I believe about this connection if I only considered what I personally experienced? Would I still feel the need to stay away, or would I simply want an honest conversation? That last question stayed with them. They tried to move past it. They set the phone down. They walked into another room. They found something else to focus on. Yet the question followed them because somewhere inside, an answer was already forming. They did not want to erase the past. They wanted to understand it correctly. And that distinction changed the emotional atmosphere completely. A few days earlier, thinking about you had felt like returning to a closed chapter. Now it felt like discovering pages they had somehow skipped. Stay till the end, because one of those missing pages contained a realization your soulmate was not prepared for. They remembered the last truly honest conversation between you, not the final awkward exchange, not the silence afterward, but the conversation before everything shifted. There had been one moment when you asked them something unexpectedly vulnerable. You wanted to know what they actually needed from you, not what they thought you should already know, not what they expected you to guess, but what they needed. Your soulmate had never answered completely. They had avoided part of the truth because saying it aloud would have meant admitting how much you mattered. They gave you a smaller answer. A safer answer. Something easier to say. And suddenly they understood that while they had been waiting for you to prove how you felt, they had never fully shown you what they were hoping for. They expected clarity while offering only fragments of their own feelings. That recognition did not create guilt. It created maturity. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate stopped viewing the past as something that had happened to them and began seeing themselves as part of the misunderstanding. They saw two people trying to protect themselves at exactly the wrong time. Two people reading silence differently. Two people waiting for reassurance while being afraid to ask for it directly. The connection had not necessarily collapsed because feeling disappeared. It had become tangled because neither person fully understood what the other was protecting. And once your soulmate saw that, another memory surfaced. A tiny moment. Almost nothing. You had sent them something ordinary, a simple thought, a small update, perhaps something that reminded you of them. At the time, your soulmate responded lightly because they were trying not to reveal how much it meant. Later, when they told someone about the exchange, they described it as casual. But it had never felt casual. They had read your message twice. Maybe more. They had wondered whether you were trying to reopen communication without placing pressure on them. They had almost answered more honestly. Almost. Then fear stepped in again. What if I misunderstand this, they thought. What if I make myself vulnerable and discover it meant nothing? So they kept their response restrained. And from your side, that restrained response may have looked exactly like what your soulmate feared seeing from you: distance. Do you see how quietly the misunderstanding grew? No villain. No terrible secret. Just two people protecting themselves so carefully that each protection looked like rejection to the other. Your soulmate finally saw the pattern. And once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to keep repeating it without noticing. The next thing they did surprised even them. They opened a blank message. Not your conversation. Just a blank space where they could type without sending anything. Their fingers hovered for a while. Then they wrote one sentence: "I think I misunderstood you." They stared at those words. Deleted them. Typed something else. "I wish we had talked differently." Deleted again. Then another sentence appeared: "There are things I understand now that I didn't understand then." This time, they did not delete it immediately. They let the words remain. Something about seeing the sentence in front of them made the realization feel real. Your soulmate was no longer wondering whether they had misunderstood the past. They knew they had misunderstood at least part of it. And here is the rare emotional shift they experienced next. Instead of feeling embarrassed by that realization, they felt relief. Because if the story had been misunderstood, then maybe the future was not as closed as they had assumed. Not guaranteed. Not predetermined. simply open enough for honesty. That possibility was all they needed to begin thinking differently. Don't skip this moment, because this is when the title of this story becomes even more meaningful. Your soulmate had once been warned to never come back to you. Those words had sounded final. But now they were realizing that returning did not have to mean repeating the past. Returning could simply mean returning to the truth. Returning to a conversation left unfinished. Returning to a question nobody had answered properly. Returning with more understanding than either of you had before. That was the shocking truth changing everything. The connection did not necessarily need another beginning. It might only need the honesty that was missing from the ending. Your soulmate leaned back and thought about what they would actually say if the opportunity appeared. They did not imagine some perfect speech. They imagined something smaller. Something sincere. Maybe they would tell you they finally understood why you had needed time. Maybe they would admit that someone's advice influenced them more than they realized. Maybe they would simply ask what you had been trying to say during that final complicated conversation. The thought made them nervous, but this nervousness felt different. Before, nervousness meant danger to them. Now it felt like evidence that something mattered. And slowly, another truth emerged. The person who gave the warning had never told your soulmate that you were a bad person. That was how the memory had changed over time. The actual warning had been closer to, do not go back until you know what you want. Your soulmate had remembered only the first half, do not go back. They had forgotten the condition attached to it. Until you know what you want. That missing piece changed the meaning of everything. The advice had not necessarily been telling them to leave you forever. It had been telling them not to return from confusion. Yet confusion was no longer what your soulmate felt. They were beginning to know exactly what they wanted. Not certainty about the entire future. Not promises. Not a perfect reunion. They wanted truth. They wanted one conversation where nobody guessed, nobody interpreted silence, nobody allowed other voices to speak louder than the two people actually involved. And that desire felt so simple that they wondered why it had taken them this long to recognize it. But the most important realization was still approaching. Because while your soulmate was examining the warning, they remembered something the other person had said immediately afterward, a sentence that had seemed insignificant at the time. The sentence was, if you ever discover you were wrong about what happened, then you'll know what to do. Your soulmate had forgotten those words entirely. Now they returned with startling clarity. If you ever discover you were wrong about what happened. They read that sentence in their memory again and again. Suddenly, it felt less like a warning and more like permission to reconsider. And your soulmate had just discovered exactly that. They had been wrong about part of what happened. Not everything. Not every feeling. But enough to change the direction of the story. They reached for their phone again. This time they opened your conversation. The screen felt strangely familiar. They scrolled to the last message. Their thumb rested near the typing box, but they did not write anything yet. Instead, they whispered a question only they could hear. If I say something now, will they understand why it took me so long? And somewhere inside that question was another truth they had not admitted yet. They were no longer afraid of coming back to you. They were afraid that they had waited too long. But then another memory surfaced, one connected directly to something you once told them about timing, forgiveness, and what you believed honest people should do when they finally understand something they did not understand before. That memory is about to become the reason your soulmate stops staring at the empty message box, and finally decides whether to type the words they have been carrying all this time.